At 4:17 a.m. Moscow time on a cold Tuesday morning, three Russian Tu-95 strategic bombers lifted off from Engels 2 Air Base in the Saratov Oblast and turned their noses toward the Arctic Circle, carrying a payload configuration that triggered immediate alarm inside the Pentagon's National Military Command Center. What happened in the next 90 minutes would expose a covert Russian operation that NATO intelligence services had been tracking in fragments for over 14 months, and what those fragments now revealed when assembled together has placed the entire alliance on its highest readiness posture since the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. The aircraft did not file standard international flight plans. They did not respond to civilian air traffic control. They climbed to 39,000 feet, accelerated to 442 knots, and pushed directly into the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap, the strategic maritime choke point that has defined NATO's northern defense architecture since 1949. What nobody is telling viewers right now is that those bombers were not the operation. They were the distraction. The actual operation was unfolding 1,847 miles to the south, in a place no Western analyst was watching closely enough. The information that follows comes from declassified Pentagon briefings, statements from U.S. European Command, reporting from Reuters and the Associated Press, and analysis published by the Institute for the Study of War. What it reveals is a coordinated Russian strategy that has been developing for at least 2 years, one that exploits specific weaknesses in NATO's eastern flank that defense planners in Washington, Brussels, and Warsaw have been quietly trying to address without public acknowledgement of how serious the vulnerabilities have become. The stakes here are not theoretical. Approximately 32% of European natural gas infrastructure, 41% of Baltic shipping commerce, and the security guarantees of 32 NATO member states all depend on the integrity of the alliance's deterrent posture in this specific geographic theater. If the Russian operation now being exposed succeeds in its objectives, the consequences will reach every gas station in Germany, every grocery store in Poland, every household in the Baltic states, and ultimately every American taxpayer funding the largest military alliance in human history. The Russian Federation has been conducting what military analysts now call a gray zone campaign along NATO's eastern frontier, a sustained effort that falls deliberately below the threshold of conventional warfare while systematically degrading alliance cohesion, testing response protocols, and mapping critical infrastructure vulnerabilities. The campaign operates across 5 distinct domains simultaneously, and Pentagon assessments leaked to the Washington Post indicate that Russian planners have allocated approximately $4.7 billion annually to this effort over the past 36 months. The first domain is undersea infrastructure targeting. Since October 2023, NATO has documented 14 separate incidents involving damage to subsea cables and pipelines in the Baltic Sea, including the Baltic Connector pipeline between Finland and Estonia, the Sea Lion 1 fiber optic cable connecting Finland to Germany, and the S-Link 2 power cable linking Estonia to Finland. Each incident was officially attributed to anchor dragging or vessel accidents, but classified intelligence assessments shared with NATO partners identify a pattern that statistical analysis indicates has less than a 0.3% probability of being coincidental. The second domain is electronic warfare and GPS jamming. Across the Baltic region, commercial aviation has reported a 1,400% increase in GPS interference incidents since January 2024. Finnish, Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, and Polish aviation authorities have collectively logged over 46,000 separate jamming events in the past 18 months. The interference originates from Russian electronic warfare facilities in Kaliningrad, the heavily militarized Russian exclave wedged between Poland and Lithuania, and from mobile platforms operating from St. Petersburg. The third domain involves airspace violations and probing flights. Russian military aircraft have entered NATO airspace 287 times in the past calendar year, compared to 89 incidents in the year preceding Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Each violation forces NATO interceptors to scramble, generates approximately $340,000 in operational costs per response, and provides Russian intelligence with detailed data on alliance reaction times, communication protocols, and air defense radar coverage patterns. The fourth domain is the deployment of small unmanned aerial systems across NATO borders. In September and October of the current year alone, Polish, Romanian, and Estonian authorities have reported 73 separate incidents of Russian-origin drones crossing into alliance territory. Some of these were Shahed 136 loitering munitions of Iranian design, others were domestically produced Lancet variants, and a concerning subset were small commercial-grade quadcopters carrying surveillance payloads that mapped specific military installations, communication nodes, and energy infrastructure facilities. The fifth domain, and the one that has now produced the panic in Washington, involves something significantly more dangerous. According to reporting from the Wall Street Journal and confirmed by sources within U.S. European Command, Russian forces have been pre-positioning specialized military equipment in Belarus, Kaliningrad, and the occupied territories of Ukraine, equipment whose only logical purpose is to enable a rapid, limited offensive operation against a specific NATO member state designed to test Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. The deadline that Pentagon planners are now watching arrives in approximately 47 days. That is the window during which Russian forces will have completed the redeployment of an estimated 132,000 troops from the Ukrainian theater to forward positions along the Belarusian-Lithuanian border and the Kaliningrad Polish frontier. After that window closes, the strategic calculation changes fundamentally, and the options available to NATO decision-makers narrow in ways that defense officials describe as deeply uncomfortable. To understand what Russian planners are actually attempting, viewers must first understand the specific geographic feature that anchors the entire operation. The Suwałki Gap is a 65-mile stretch of territory along the Polish-Lithuanian border, bounded on the west by the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad and on the east by Belarus, which functions effectively as a Russian military protectorate. This narrow corridor is the only land connection between the three Baltic NATO states and the rest of the alliance. Cut the Suwałki Gap, and Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania become operationally isolated from any reinforcement that does not arrive by sea or air. Russian military doctrine has identified this geographic feature as the single most exploitable vulnerability in the entire NATO defense architecture. Classified war games conducted by the RAND Corporation between 2014 and 2019 concluded that Russian conventional forces could potentially reach the Estonian and Latvian capitals within 36 to 60 hours of initiating an operation, a timeline that falls dramatically inside the alliance's mobilization window for substantial reinforcement. The 2024 update to those war games, portions of which have been declassified, indicates that Russian capabilities in this scenario have improved by an estimated 23% over the past 5 years. The forces now positioned to execute this scenario include the Russian 1st Guards Tank Army, the 6th Combined Arms Army, the 11th Army Corps based in Kaliningrad, and elements of the Belarusian armed forces operating under Russian operational control through the Union State Military Framework signed in December 1999. Together, these formations field approximately 1,947 main battle tanks, 3,200 armored fighting vehicles, 612 self-propelled artillery systems, 240 multiple-launch rocket systems, and integrated air defense networks built around S-400 Triumph surface-to-air missile batteries with engagement ranges of 250 miles. The Kaliningrad exclave alone hosts a military presence that exceeds the total combined active-duty ground forces of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania by a factor of approximately 4.2 to 1. The Iskander-M short-range ballistic missile systems deployed there can range targets across the entire Baltic region with conventional warheads carrying 1,540 pounds of high explosive, and the same launchers are dual-capable, meaning they can deliver tactical nuclear warheads with yields ranging from 10 to 50 kilotons. The strategic implications of that dual capability are precisely why Pentagon planners describe the Kaliningrad threat as uniquely complicated. But here is where it gets truly extraordinary. The operation now being assembled does not appear to be designed as a traditional invasion. It is something far more sophisticated and far more dangerous to alliance cohesion. Russian planners have apparently studied the political dynamics of NATO Article 5 activation with extraordinary care, and they have identified a specific approach that exploits a fundamental ambiguity in the treaty's collective defense provisions. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, signed in Washington on April 4, 1949, states that an armed attack against one ally shall be considered an attack against all. However, the article does not specify what level of military action constitutes an armed attack sufficient to trigger collective response. The treaty leaves that determination to each individual member state, requiring them to take such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force. That phrasing, drafted to provide flexibility for the United States Senate during the original ratification process, has now become a vulnerability that Russian strategists believe they can exploit. The scenario Pentagon planners are now wargaming involves a limited Russian incursion of perhaps 15 to 30 miles into NATO territory, conducted by formations small enough to plausibly deny full state authorization, accompanied by overwhelming nuclear signaling designed to fracture Allied consensus on the appropriate response. The objective would not be territorial conquest. The objective would be to demonstrate that Article 5 is conditional rather than absolute, that some members will respond and others will hesitate, and that the political cohesion of the alliance can be broken without firing a shot at most NATO capitals. If viewers want to understand exactly how this scenario could unfold and what the Pentagon believes the next 90 days will bring, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell, because the analysis being released over the coming days will cover developments that mainstream coverage is deliberately avoiding. This story is moving faster than any news cycle can track, and the next update will be critical for understanding what Western intelligence services are now confirming. The economic dimensions of this confrontation are equally consequential. European energy security has been fundamentally restructured since February 2022, but the dependencies that remain are significant and concentrated in ways that create specific Russian leverage. The Baltic states import approximately 67% of their natural gas through infrastructure that runs within 200 miles of Russian or Belarusian territory. Polish industrial production depends on supply chains routing through ports that lie within easy strike range of Kaliningrad-based systems. German manufacturing, which represents 23.4% of European Union GDP, requires uninterrupted Baltic shipping for raw material imports valued at approximately $487 billion annually. A successful Russian operation that demonstrated NATO's hesitation to defend a member state in full would not need to capture territory to achieve catastrophic economic consequences. Insurance markets would reprice every shipping route, every energy facility, and every industrial operation within range of Russian forces. London-based maritime insurers have already increased premiums for Baltic transit by 340% over the past 2 years, and a confirmed demonstration of NATO weakness would push those rates into territory that effectively closes commercial shipping to the Baltic states. The economic damage from such a development is estimated by Goldman Sachs analysts at approximately $890 billion in the first 12 months alone. The military technical dimensions of the standoff reveal capabilities that mainstream commentary consistently underestimates. The United States Air Force has deployed F-35A Lightning II fifth-generation fighters to Łask Air Base in central Poland, where 24 of the aircraft now operate from hardened shelters reinforced to withstand cluster munition attack. Each F-35A carries the AN/APG-81 active electronically scanned array radar, which can detect and track targets at ranges exceeding 90 nautical miles while remaining undetected by Russian air defense systems through low observable design features that reduce radar cross-section to approximately 0.0015 square meters. The United States Navy has stationed the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer USS Gravely in the Baltic Sea, a vessel that displaces 9,200 tons fully loaded, carries a crew of 329 sailors, and is armed with a 96-cell Mark 41 vertical launch system capable of firing Tomahawk cruise missiles with 1,000-mile range, Standard Missile 6 air defense interceptors, Standard Missile 3 ballistic missile defense weapons, and evolved Sea Sparrow point defense missiles. The Gravely is supported by the Ticonderoga-class cruiser USS Vela Gulf and the Virginia-class fast-attack submarine USS New Mexico, whose presence has not been officially acknowledged but has been confirmed through commercial satellite imagery analysis published by Naval News. U.S. Army forces in Poland now include the 3rd Armored Brigade Combat Team of the 4th Infantry Division, equipped with 87 M1A2 SEPV-3 Abrams main battle tanks, 152 M2A4 Bradley fighting vehicles, 18 M109A7 Paladin self-propelled howitzers, and an integrated combat aviation brigade fielding AH-64E Apache Guardian attack helicopters. The Abrams variant deployed represents the most advanced version currently in service, carrying composite armor enhanced with depleted uranium inserts, the Trophy Active Protection System designed to intercept incoming anti-tank missiles, and the M829A4 Advanced Kinetic Energy Cartridge that can defeat any Russian armor currently in service at ranges exceeding 4,000 meters. The historical parallel that defense analysts keep returning to is not the Cold War in general, but a very specific moment within it. In November 1983, NATO conducted an exercise called Able Archer 83 that simulated a coordinated nuclear release against Warsaw Pact forces. Soviet intelligence services interpreted the exercise as potential cover for an actual first strike, and according to documents declassified in 2015, the Soviet leadership came closer to authorizing preemptive nuclear action during that exercise than at any other moment in the Cold War, including the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The lesson defense planners draw from Able Archer is that the most dangerous moments are not those when leaders intend war, but those when they misread each other's intentions during periods of acute tension. The current moment carries similar characteristics. Russian state media has been broadcasting increasingly explicit nuclear threats since September, with prominent commentators on the state-controlled Channel 1 discussing scenarios involving tactical nuclear use against Poland and the Baltic states with a frequency that Pentagon analysts assess as deliberate signaling rather than spontaneous extremism. Russian President Vladimir Putin himself referenced the country's nuclear doctrine in remarks delivered to the Federal Assembly, specifically lowering the threshold for nuclear use against non-nuclear states supported by nuclear powers, language that maps directly onto the situation of NATO's eastern members. The institutional dimensions of the crisis extend deep into the Russian military and political structure. The Russian Federation's Security Council, chaired by former Federal Security Service Director and current Putin advisor Nikolai Patrushev, has been the principal forum for developing the strategy now being executed. Patrushev has spent over 4 decades within the Soviet and Russian intelligence apparatus, beginning his career with the KGB in 1975, and his ideological framework treats the existence of NATO as an existential threat to Russia rather than as a defensive alliance. His son, Dmitry, currently serves as deputy prime minister, and the family's institutional position reflects the consolidation of power within networks that originated in the late Soviet security services. The Russian defense minister, Andrei Belousov, was appointed in May 2024 specifically to bring economic warfare expertise to the military planning process. Unlike his predecessor, Sergei Shoigu, Belousov is not a career military officer, but rather an economist whose previous role as first deputy prime minister gave him direct authority over Russian industrial policy and resource allocation. His appointment signaled the Kremlin's intention to integrate economic warfare with conventional military operations in ways that the previous defense leadership had pursued less systematically. The chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov, remains in his position despite extensive criticism of the conduct of operations in Ukraine. Gerasimov is the architect of what Western analysts call the Gerasimov Doctrine, though the term oversimplifies his actual writings. His 2013 article in the Military Industrial Courier outlined an approach to modern warfare that emphasizes the integration of military, economic, informational, and political tools in ways that blur the distinction between war and peace. The operation now being assembled along NATO's eastern frontier represents the most ambitious application of this approach since the doctrine was first articulated. The Belarusian dimension of the crisis cannot be overlooked. President Alexander Lukashenko, who has ruled Belarus continuously since July 1994, has effectively surrendered Belarusian sovereignty to Moscow in exchange for personal political survival. Russian forces now operate from Belarusian territory with minimal restriction. Russian tactical nuclear weapons have been deployed to Belarusian storage facilities under arrangements announced in March 2023, and the Belarusian armed forces have been integrated into Russian command structures through the Regional Group of Forces framework. Any Russian operation along NATO's eastern frontier will treat Belarusian territory as Russian territory for operational purposes. The Chinese position on the developing crisis has been characteristically opaque. Beijing has declined to publicly endorse Russian actions, but Chinese banks continue to facilitate Russian trade in ways that have proven essential for Russian economic resilience. Chinese exports to Russia of dual-use components have increased by 84% over the past 2 years, and Chinese commercial drone manufacturers have provided components found in Russian military systems recovered on the Ukrainian battlefield. Beijing's calculation appears to be that a weakened NATO serves long-term Chinese strategic interests in the Pacific, even if direct military alignment with Russia would carry diplomatic costs that Beijing prefers to avoid. Subscribe to this channel right now if you want to understand exactly what the Chinese strategic calculation means for the Pacific theater and how Beijing's positioning will shape American military options in the months ahead. Because the connection between European deterrence and Pacific stability is one of the most underanalyzed dimensions of the current moment, and the analysis released over the coming weeks will cover developments that no other source is currently addressing comprehensively. The Polish response to the developing threat has been the most aggressive of any NATO member state. Warsaw has committed to defense spending of 4.7% of gross domestic product, the highest ratio of any alliance member, and has placed orders for 1,000 K2 Black Panther main battle tanks from South Korea, 672 K9 self-propelled howitzers, 48 FA-50 light combat aircraft, and 288 K239 Chunmoo multiple launch rocket systems. Polish armed forces are scheduled to reach 300,000 active personnel by 2035, which would make Poland the largest land force in continental Europe west of Russia and Ukraine. The Polish strategic calculation is that conventional deterrence sufficient to defeat any Russian operation must be physically present in Poland rather than dependent on reinforcement from elsewhere in the alliance. The German response has been more complicated. Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who took office following federal elections, has reversed many of the cautious policies of his predecessor and committed to substantial increases in defense spending. The Bundeswehr has announced plans to reach 203,000 active personnel and has placed orders for 105 additional Leopard 2A8 main battle tanks, 50 Eurofighter Typhoon tranche, 5 aircraft, and substantial expansions of air defense capabilities, including the Arrow 3 system purchased from Israel. However, German industrial capacity to produce military equipment at the rates required has proven significantly constrained, and delivery timelines for many systems extend into the early 2030s. The British contribution centers on the deployment of the Carrier Strike Group built around HMS Prince of Wales, which currently operates in the North Atlantic with embarked F-35B Lightning II aircraft from 617th Squadron and the United States Marine Corps VMFA 2111. The British Army has positioned the 1st Armored Infantry Brigade in Estonia under the Enhanced Forward Presence Framework, and the Royal Air Force maintains a continuous quick reaction alert posture from RAF Lossiemouth in Scotland, with Typhoon FGR-4 aircraft armed with Meteor Beyond Visual Range air-to-air missiles. The next 60 days will determine whether the Russian operation now being assembled proceeds to execution, or whether NATO deterrent measures persuade the Kremlin to pause and reassess. 3 primary scenarios are now under active analysis within the Pentagon's J5 Strategic Plans and Policy Directorate, and each carries dramatically different implications for the future of European security and American strategic commitments. The first scenario involves Russian operational pause. In this trajectory, the visible NATO buildup persuades Russian planners that the costs of a limited incursion exceed the political benefits, and the operation is shelved or significantly modified. This outcome would represent a tactical victory for alliance deterrence but would not resolve the underlying strategic competition. Russian forces would remain in their forward positions, the gray zone campaign would continue, and the next testing point would emerge within 18 to 24 months as Russian planners identified new vulnerabilities to exploit. The second scenario involves limited Russian action falling below the conventional Article 5 threshold. This trajectory would see Russian forces conduct cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, additional sabotage of undersea cables, drone incursions against military facilities, or potentially limited cross-border raids by formations operating without acknowledged state authorization. The objective would be to demonstrate that the alliance cannot or will not respond decisively to actions that cause damage but do not unambiguously constitute an armed attack. This scenario is the one Pentagon analysts assess as most likely, with probability estimates ranging from 41 to 58%, depending on the specific assumptions. The third scenario involves Russian operations that cross the conventional threshold and force a direct NATO military response. This trajectory would begin a process whose conclusion no analyst can confidently predict. Russian doctrine appears to assume that NATO would hesitate, that political divisions would prevent unified response, and that limited conventional success could be locked in through nuclear signaling that fractures alliance cohesion before reinforcement could be mobilized. American defense planners assess this Russian assumption as fundamentally flawed, but acknowledge that flawed assumptions have started major wars throughout history. The economic consequences of any of these scenarios will reach every American household. European energy markets remain interconnected with global commodity flows, and disruption to Baltic shipping would push natural gas prices in the United States higher by an estimated 18 to 27% within 90 days. Defense industrial base production would accelerate dramatically, with implications for federal spending priorities and tax policy that would shape the next two American election cycles. Trade flows through European ports would reroute through alternative paths, increasing costs and delivery times for manufactured goods imported by American consumers and businesses. The historical parallel that ultimately matters most is not Able Archer 83 or even the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. It is the period between the Anschluss of March 1938 and the German invasion of Poland in September 1939, when a revisionist power systematically tested the willingness of established powers to defend the international order they had constructed. The lesson of that period is that ambiguity in deterrent commitments invites testing, that testing escalates when initial probes succeed, and that the costs of restoring deterrence after it has been allowed to erode dramatically exceed the costs of maintaining it from the beginning. The clock is now running on a window that will close in approximately 47 days. By the end of that window, Russian forces will have completed redeployment to forward positions, weather conditions will favor offensive operations across the North European plain, and the political calendars of major NATO members will have created decision-making constraints that complicate rapid alliance response. What happens in those 47 days will shape the strategic environment for the remainder of the decade, and quite possibly for considerably longer. The questions that remain unresolved are the questions that matter most. Will the Russian leadership conclude that the costs of action exceed the benefits, or will they assess that the alliance is too divided to respond decisively? Will the German government sustain its current rearmament trajectory through the political challenges that will inevitably arise as defense spending crowds out social programs? Will the Polish military buildup reach operational maturity quickly enough to deter aggression rather than merely respond to it? Will the American commitment to European defense remain unconditional through the political dynamics of the current administration's relationship with NATO partners? The next 48 hours will be critical for understanding which trajectory the crisis follows. NATO defense ministers convene in Brussels in 14 days, and the decisions taken at that meeting will signal alliance unity or fracture in ways that Russian planners will read carefully. American intelligence agencies are reportedly preparing assessments for delivery to congressional leadership that will dramatically reshape public understanding of the threat picture, and the political response to those briefings will shape the spending decisions made over the coming budget cycle. Whether the alliance holds, whether the deterrent posture proves credible, whether the gray zone campaign escalates or pauses, whether nuclear signaling remains rhetorical or transitions to operational deployment, these are the questions that will define the strategic environment in which every viewer of this content will live for the foreseeable future. The Pentagon is in panic mode for reasons that go far beyond the specific operation now being assembled. The panic reflects recognition that the post-1945 security order is being tested in ways it has not been tested since its construction, and the outcome of that test will shape global affairs for generations. What happens next will determine whether NATO emerges from this crisis stronger and more cohesive, or whether the alliance enters a period of fundamental strategic reconsideration that could ultimately produce its dissolution as a meaningful military instrument. The next update from this analysis will cover the Brussels ministerial meeting outcomes and the implications for American strategic commitments over the coming year. The story is moving faster than any news cycle can track, and the developments still ahead will reshape the international system in ways that very few analysts are willing to discuss openly. The clock is running. The pieces are in motion. The decisions being made right now in Moscow, Washington, Brussels, Warsaw, and Berlin will determine outcomes that no one can yet predict with confidence. What the Pentagon knows, and what is now being exposed, is that the period of relative European stability that defined the post-Cold War decades has ended, and what comes next remains genuinely uncertain.